Climate countdown. Climate change is an urgent global challenge that is happening at an unprecedented pace and scale, and it is widely referred to as the climate countdown. In recent years, the impact of climate change has become increasingly visible, with rising temperatures, changing weather patterns, and extreme weather events such as hurricanes, floods, and wildfires occurring more frequently and with greater intensity. Scientists have been warning about the dangers of climate change for decades, and recent years have seen a growing sense of urgency and a recognition that we must take immediate action to address the crisis. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, has issued several reports in recent years, highlighting the increasing severity of the situation and calling for urgent action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The effects of climate change are being felt around the world, with rising sea levels threatening to inundate coastal communities, heat waves and droughts leading to crop failures and food shortages, and the loss of biodiversity threatening ecosystems and human health. In addition, climate change is exacerbating social and economic inequality, with the poorest and most vulnerable communities often being the hardest hit. To address the climate crisis, there is an urgent need for concerted global action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, transition to clean energy sources, and implement policies and technologies that promote sustainable development. Governments, businesses, and individuals all have a role to play in this effort, and there is a growing recognition that we must act quickly to mitigate the worst effects of climate change and ensure a sustainable future for all. Factors. Climate change is caused by a complex interplay of various natural and human factors, including greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gases, GHGs, are a major factor in climate change because they trap heat in the Earth's atmosphere, leading to a warming effect on the planet. The most common GHGs include carbon dioxide, CO2, methane, CH4, and nitrous oxide, N2O, which are released into the atmosphere through human activities, such as burning fossil fuels, deforestation, and agriculture. As the concentration of GHGs in the atmosphere increases, more heat is trapped, leading to rising temperatures and a range of other impacts, including melting glaciers, rising sea levels, and more frequent and intense weather events. Reducing GHG emissions through the adoption of renewable energy sources and other measures is critical to mitigating the impacts of climate change. Deforestation. Forests play a crucial role in regulating the Earth's climate by absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Deforestation, especially in tropical regions, contributes significantly to the increase in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Burning fossil fuels. Burning fossil fuels is a major factor in climate change because it releases large amounts of greenhouse gases, GHGs, into the atmosphere, primarily carbon dioxide, CO2, which contributes to the greenhouse effect and the warming of the Earth's climate. When fossil fuels, such as coal, oil, and natural gas, are burned for energy, carbon is released into the atmosphere in the form of CO2. This carbon is part of a natural carbon cycle, but burning fossil fuels releases carbon that has been sequestered in the Earth's crust for millions of years. As a result, the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere has increased by more than 40% since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. This increase in CO2 and other GHGs in the atmosphere traps more heat from the sun's radiation, causing the Earth's temperature to rise, which is known as global warming. The effects of global warming include rising sea levels, more frequent and intense heat waves, droughts, wildfires, and changes in precipitation patterns, among other impacts. Industrial processes. Industrial processes are a major contributor to climate change through the emission of greenhouse gases, GHGs, into the atmosphere. GHGs, such as carbon dioxide, CO2, methane, CH4, and nitrous oxide, N2O, trap heat from the sun's radiation and cause the Earth's temperature to rise. Industrial processes that rely on the burning of fossil fuels, such as coal, oil, and natural gas, for energy release large amounts of CO2 into the atmosphere. Additionally, the extraction and transportation of fossil fuels also contribute to GHG emissions. Agricultural practices. Agricultural practices are a major factor in climate change due to their significant contributions to greenhouse gas, GHG, emissions. Agriculture is a major source of methane, CH4, and nitrous oxide, N2O, emissions, which are powerful GHGs that trap heat in the atmosphere. These emissions come from sources such as livestock digestion and manure management, as well as from the use of nitrogen fertilizers in crop production. Climate change can impact agriculture by altering precipitation patterns, increasing the frequency of extreme weather events, and reducing crop yields. Sustainable agricultural practices, such as reducing fertilizer use and improving livestock management, can help reduce GHG emissions and mitigate the impacts of climate change on agriculture. Natural factors. Natural factors, such as volcanic activity, solar radiation, and changes in the Earth's orbit and axis, have contributed to climate change throughout Earth's history. These factors can affect the amount of energy that the Earth receives from the Sun, as well as the way that this energy is distributed and reflected within the Earth's atmosphere and on its surface. While these natural factors have historically influenced climate change, they are not sufficient to explain the current rate of warming and the observed changes in the Earth's climate over the past century, which are primarily driven by human activities, such as the burning of fossil fuels and deforestation. Overall, the primary driver of climate change is human activity, particularly the burning of fossil fuels and deforestation. Addressing these factors through global action and individual efforts is crucial to mitigate the impacts of climate change and ensure a sustainable future for all. Effects. Climate change has a wide range of impacts on the Earth's natural systems, as well as on human societies and economies. Some of the key effects of climate change include rising temperatures. Global temperatures have been increasing at an unprecedented rate, leading to heat waves, droughts, and wildfires that can cause significant damage to ecosystems, agriculture, and infrastructure. Extreme weather events. Climate change is causing more frequent and intense extreme weather events such as hurricanes, floods, and storms, which can lead to loss of life, property damage, and economic disruption. Sea level rise. As the Earth's temperature warms, the polar ice caps and glaciers are melting, causing sea levels to rise. This poses a significant threat to coastal communities, infrastructure, and ecosystems. Biodiversity loss. Climate change is driving many plant and animal species to extinction, as they struggle to adapt to rapidly changing environmental conditions. Health impacts. Climate change is increasing the prevalence of diseases such as malaria and dengue fever, as well as worsening air quality and heat-related illnesses. Economic impacts. The effects of climate change are likely to have significant economic impacts, including damage to infrastructure, loss of agricultural productivity, and disruptions to global supply chains. Overall, the impacts of climate change are already being felt around the world, and they are projected to become increasingly severe in the coming decades if we do not take immediate action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and mitigate the effects of climate change. Countries that are most responsible for climate change. Climate change is a global problem caused by the cumulative effect of greenhouse gas emissions from human activities around the world. However, some countries are responsible for a larger share of greenhouse gas emissions than others, primarily due to their historical emissions and the size of their economies. According to data from the Global Carbon Project, the top 10 countries that are responsible for the majority of global carbon dioxide emissions are China. China is responsible for a significant amount of greenhouse gas emissions, primarily due to the country's large population, rapid industrialization, and dependence on coal for energy production. According to data from the Global Carbon Project, China is the largest emitter of carbon dioxide, accounting for approximately 28% of global emissions. The country has made some efforts to transition to renewable energy and reduce emissions, but its overall emissions continue to rise. Therefore, China is seen as a key player in global efforts to address climate change, and the country's actions will be crucial in mitigating the effects of climate change in the future. United States. The United States is responsible for a significant amount of greenhouse gas emissions, primarily due to the country's large population, high levels of energy consumption, and dependence on fossil fuels. According to data from the Global Carbon Project, the United States is the second largest emitter of carbon dioxide, accounting for approximately 15% of global emissions. While the US has made some efforts to reduce emissions, such as promoting renewable energy and improving energy efficiency, the country's overall emissions have remained relatively stable in recent years. Therefore, the US is seen as a key player in global efforts to address climate change, and its actions will be crucial in mitigating the effects of climate change in the future. India. India is responsible for a significant amount of greenhouse gas emissions, primarily due to the country's large population, rapid economic growth, and dependence on coal for energy production. According to data from the Global Carbon Project, India is the third largest emitter of carbon dioxide, accounting for approximately 7% of global emissions. India has made some efforts to transition to renewable energy and reduce emissions, but its overall emissions continue to rise as the country's economy grows. Therefore, India is seen as a key player in global efforts to address climate change, and its actions will be crucial in mitigating the effects of climate change in the future. Russia. Russia is responsible for a significant amount of greenhouse gas emissions, primarily due to the country's large land area, reliance on fossil fuels, and its oil and gas industry. According to data from the Global Carbon Project, Russia is the fourth largest emitter of carbon dioxide, accounting for approximately 5% of global emissions. The country's emissions have decreased significantly since the collapse of the Soviet Union, but they have started to rise again in recent years. Russia has made some efforts to reduce emissions, such as increasing the use of natural gas and investing in renewable energy, but more needs to be done to transition to a low-carbon economy. Therefore, Russia is seen as a key player in global efforts to address climate change, and its actions will be crucial in mitigating the effects of climate change in the future. Japan. Japan is responsible for a significant amount of greenhouse gas emissions, primarily due to the country's high levels of energy consumption and dependence on fossil fuels for energy production. According to data from the Global Carbon Project, Japan is the fifth largest emitter of carbon dioxide, accounting for approximately 3% of global emissions. Japan has made some efforts to reduce emissions, such as promoting renewable energy and improving energy efficiency, but the country's overall emissions have remained relatively stable in recent years. Therefore, Japan is seen as a key player in global efforts to address climate change, and its actions will be crucial in mitigating the effects of climate change in the future. Iran. Iran is responsible for a significant amount of greenhouse gas emissions, primarily due to the country's large oil and gas industry and its high levels of energy consumption. According to data from the Global Carbon Project, Iran is the ninth largest emitter of carbon dioxide, accounting for approximately 2% of global emissions. Iran has made some efforts to reduce emissions, such as increasing the use of natural gas and investing in renewable energy, but more needs to be done to transition to a low-carbon economy. Additionally, Iran is particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, such as water scarcity and desertification, which could have severe consequences for the country's economy and society. Therefore, Iran is seen as a key player in global efforts to address climate change, and its actions will be crucial in mitigating the effects of climate change in the future. South Korea. South Korea is responsible for a significant amount of greenhouse gas emissions, primarily due to the country's high levels of energy consumption and dependence on fossil fuels for energy production. According to data from the Global Carbon Project, South Korea is the seventh largest emitter of carbon dioxide, accounting for approximately 2.5% of global emissions. South Korea has made some efforts to reduce emissions, such as promoting renewable energy and improving energy efficiency, but the country's overall emissions have remained relatively stable in recent years. Therefore, South Korea is seen as a key player in global efforts to address climate change, and its actions will be crucial in mitigating the effects of climate change in the future. Canada. Canada is responsible for a significant amount of greenhouse gas emissions, primarily due to the country's large land area, high levels of energy consumption, and dependence on fossil fuels for energy production. According to data from the Global Carbon Project, Canada is the 10th largest emitter of carbon dioxide, accounting for approximately 1.6% of global emissions. Canada has made some efforts to reduce emissions, such as promoting renewable energy and improving energy efficiency, but the country's overall emissions have remained relatively stable in recent years. Additionally, Canada is particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, such as melting permafrost and changing weather patterns, which could have severe consequences for the country's environment and society. Therefore, Canada is seen as a key player in global efforts to address climate change, and its actions will be crucial in mitigating the effects of climate change in the future. Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is responsible for a significant amount of greenhouse gas emissions, primarily due to the country's large oil and gas industry and its high levels of energy consumption. According to data from the Global Carbon Project, Saudi Arabia is the 6th largest emitter of carbon dioxide, accounting for approximately 2.5% of global emissions. Saudi Arabia has made some efforts to reduce emissions, such as investing in renewable energy and increasing the use of natural gas, but more needs to be done to transition to a low-carbon economy. Additionally, Saudi Arabia is particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, such as water scarcity and desertification, which could have severe consequences for the country's economy and society. Therefore, Saudi Arabia is seen as a key player in global efforts to address climate change, and its actions will be crucial in mitigating the effects of climate change in the future. Together, these countries are responsible for approximately 2/3 of global carbon dioxide emissions. It is important to note that responsibility for climate change is not just about the amount of greenhouse gases emitted, but also about the capacity of a country to address the problem. Many of the countries that contribute the least to global emissions are also the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, such as small island nations, low-lying coastal regions, and developing countries. Therefore, addressing the problem of climate change requires global cooperation and action, with all countries working together to reduce emissions and mitigate the effects of climate change. Countries that work for reducing factors of climate change. There are several countries that are taking ambitious steps to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and mitigate the effects of climate change. These countries recognize the urgency of the problem and are implementing policies and programs to transition to clean energy and reduce their carbon footprint. Some of the leading countries in this regard include Sweden. Sweden is widely recognized as a leader in renewable energy, with a goal of being carbon neutral by 2045. The country has implemented policies to promote renewable energy, energy efficiency, and sustainable transport. Germany. Germany has set ambitious targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions and transitioning to renewable energy. The country is phasing out nuclear power and investing heavily in wind and solar energy. Denmark. Denmark has set a goal of being carbon neutral by 2050 and is already well on its way, with over 40% of its electricity coming from wind power. The country has also implemented policies to promote energy efficiency and sustainable transport. Norway. Norway is a major oil and gas producer, but the country is also investing heavily in renewable energy and electric vehicles. The government has set a goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by at least 40% by 2030. Costa Rica. Costa Rica is one of the few countries in the world that is already carbon neutral, thanks to its investment in renewable energy, reforestation, and sustainable agriculture. The country is also working to promote electric vehicles and sustainable transport. United Kingdom. The United Kingdom has set an ambitious target of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by at least 68% by 2030, and reaching net zero emissions by 2050. The country is investing heavily in renewable energy, electric vehicles, and energy efficiency. These countries are just a few examples of the many countries around the world that are taking action to address climate change. However, global cooperation and action is necessary to tackle this global problem, and all countries must work together to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and mitigate the effects of climate change. Organizations that will work to reduce global warming. There are numerous organizations working to address climate change and global warming, ranging from non-profit organizations to international governmental organizations. Here are some of the most prominent organizations working on this issue. United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. The UNFCCC is an international organization dedicated to addressing climate change through global cooperation and action. The organization facilitates international negotiations and agreements, and promotes cooperation on climate change mitigation and adaptation. Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC. The IPCC is a scientific body established by the United Nations to provide policymakers with objective scientific information on climate change, its impacts and potential future risks, and possible response options. World Wildlife Fund, WWF. The WWF is a global environmental organization that works to protect endangered species and habitats, promote sustainable agriculture and forestry, and reduce greenhouse gas emissions through a range of programs and initiatives. The Nature Conservancy. The Nature Conservancy is a non-profit organization that works to protect ecologically important lands and waters, promote sustainable agriculture and forestry, and address climate change through natural climate solutions such as reforestation and soil management. Greenpeace. Greenpeace is an international environmental organization that campaigns on a range of issues, including climate change, energy, and forests. The organization advocates for a transition to renewable energy and an end to fossil fuel use. Clean Energy Ministerial, CEM. The CEM is an international forum of countries working to promote the transition to clean energy through the sharing of best practices and technology transfer. Climate Works Foundation. Climate Works is a non-profit organization that works to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and accelerate the transition to a low-carbon economy by supporting research, policy development, and public engagement. These organizations are just a few examples of the many groups working to address climate change and global warming. Their efforts are crucial in promoting global cooperation and action to mitigate the effects of climate change and transition to a sustainable future.